You think getting rich starts with money. What if money is actually the final stage, not the beginning? What if the biggest obstacle between you and the life you want isn't your circumstances, but the identity you've accepted as your own? What happens when a person decides that their future is no longer determined by their current circumstances? In this special extended psychological investigation on Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, we go beyond the familiar motivational summary and investigate the deeper ideas behind one of the most influential success books ever written. There is a false belief that people become successful because they get the right opportunity, the right family, the right education, the right connection, the right economy, the right timing. But what if opportunity isn't the beginning of the story? What if the way you think determines which opportunities you even recognize? The enemy isn't poverty. It isn't bad luck. It isn't even failure. The invisible enemy is a mind that has accepted its current circumstances as a permanent identity. A person doesn't simply say, "I don't have the money." Eventually, they begin saying, "I'm not the kind of person who can do that." That's the dangerous transition. A temporary circumstance becomes a permanent identity. Why do two people face the same obstacle and walk away with completely different futures? Nearly a century ago, Napoleon Hill became obsessed with a question. Why do some people turn definite ambitions into reality while others remain trapped in wishing? His answer became Think and Grow Rich. What if becoming successful doesn't begin with changing your circumstances, but with deciding what future you're willing to organize your life around? Have you ever wanted something so badly, but never actually moved toward it? You told yourself you would start next month, when you had more money, when you had more confidence, when life became less complicated. And somehow, next month became next year. Then one day you looked around and realized something uncomfortable. Your circumstances hadn't simply stayed the same. You had become accustomed to them. David knew that feeling. He had a dream, a big one. Whenever someone asked him what he wanted from life, he had an answer. He wanted financial freedom. He wanted to build something of his own. He wanted to stop worrying about money. He could describe the life perfectly. There was only one problem. He had no definite plan for getting there. So he kept telling himself, one day, Sarah was different. She had a plan. She had ideas. She even had the ability to make some of them work. But every time she got close to taking a serious risk, another voice appeared. What if it fails? What if people laugh? What if I'm not good enough? What if I lose what I already have? Sarah called it being realistic. But sometimes realism is simply fear, wearing a respectable name. And then there was Michael. Michael didn't have everything figured out. He wasn't the richest person in the room. He wasn't necessarily the smartest either. But he had something David and Sarah were missing. He had decided what he was trying to build. And once he decided, his daily choices began changing. Not dramatically, quietly. He stopped asking, "Do I feel like doing this?" and started asking, "Does this move me closer?" That small difference would eventually change everything. Because most people think success begins with opportunity. But Napoleon Hill became obsessed with a different question. Why do some people turn an idea into a reality, while others carry the same idea for 20 years? Why does one person encounter failure and stop, while another encounters the same failure and becomes more determined? Why does one person see an obstacle and another see a problem that simply hasn't been solved yet. Hill spent years studying successful people and eventually built his famous philosophy around a simple proposition: your mind matters. Not because thinking magically produces money, but because what you repeatedly think about can influence what you notice, what you believe is possible, what you attempt, and how long you're willing to continue. That became the foundation of Think and Grow Rich. And one of its most important ideas begins with something deceptively simple: desire. Not vague wishing. Not "I'd like to be rich." Not "it would be nice to succeed." Hill argued for a definite desire. Something specific enough that you know what you're moving toward. Think about David. He wanted financial freedom. But what did that actually mean? He couldn't answer how much, by when, through what, why. Without those answers, his dream remained emotionally exciting, but practically useless. A destination you can't describe is difficult to reach. So David finally forced himself to become specific. And something strange happened. His dream became smaller, but his actions became clearer. He could finally ask, what do I need to learn? Who do I need to meet? What must I build? What should I do today? That is the first psychological shift. A wish becomes a direction, but direction creates another problem. Because once you know what you want, you have to decide whether you're actually willing to pursue it. And this is where Sarah struggled. She had spent years waiting for certainty. She thought successful people acted because they were confident. Michael understood the opposite. Sometimes confidence comes after the decision. You don't always decide because you believe you will succeed. Sometimes you decide, and then build the belief necessary to continue. Hill called one part of this process faith. But faith here doesn't need to mean pretending everything will work. It can mean developing enough confidence in a chosen direction to keep moving before the evidence is complete. That's difficult, because your current reality will constantly argue with your future vision. Your bank account says one thing. Your past says another. Your friends may doubt you. Your first attempt may fail. And suddenly the question becomes, do I still believe in the destination? This is where many dreams disappear. Not because the dream was impossible, but because the person expected the journey to provide constant evidence that they were right. It won't. Sometimes you have to move while the evidence is incomplete. But there is an important warning here. Think and Grow Rich is sometimes reduced to a simple message. Think positively and you'll become rich. That's not enough. Thinking alone doesn't pay bills. Positive thoughts don't replace knowledge. Desire doesn't replace skill. Faith doesn't replace work. And failure isn't always caused by negative thinking. The world contains circumstances you cannot control. Luck matters. Opportunity matters. Resources matter. Other people matter. But Hill's deeper idea remains useful. Your mental habits influence how you respond to all of those things. And that's where another principle enters. Specialized knowledge. Imagine two people who want the same result. One spends years saying, I want it. The other asks, what do I need to know to create it? Those are completely different mindsets. Michael understood this. He stopped collecting motivation. He started collecting capability. Every problem became a question. Every failure became information. Every person who knew something he didn't became an opportunity to learn. And slowly, his ambition became less like a fantasy and more like a machine. But then came the part nobody enjoys. Persistence. Because persistence sounds inspiring, until you actually have to practice it. David's first serious attempt failed. He lost money. He was embarrassed. And suddenly, the dream that had seemed so exciting became painful. He began thinking, maybe this isn't for me. Sarah saw the failure and felt relieved. It confirmed everything she had feared. See, she thought, this is why I don't take risks. Michael saw exactly the same event. But he asked a different question. What went wrong? Not, why am I a failure? Not, maybe I'm not meant for this. Just, what went wrong? That question changed the emotional meaning of failure. Failure became information. And information could be used. This is one of the most powerful ideas hidden inside persistence. Persistence isn't simply doing the same thing again and again. That's stubbornness. Real persistence can mean remaining committed to the destination, while being flexible enough to change the route. That's what David eventually learned. His first plan failed, so he changed the plan. Then another problem appeared. He changed again. The goal stayed. The method evolved. And gradually, he became a different person. Not because he suddenly became smarter, because his relationship with failure changed. And perhaps this is where Think and Grow Rich becomes less about money and more about identity. Because eventually, what you repeatedly think and do begins to tell you something about who you are. If you repeatedly tell yourself, I never finish anything, you aren't simply describing your past. You're rehearsing an identity. If you repeatedly say, I'm not good with money, I'm not confident, I'm not disciplined, I'm not the kind of person who succeeds, eventually, those sentences stop sounding like observations. They start sounding like facts. Hill's concept of autosuggestion was built around this idea of repeatedly feeding the mind a chosen direction. But we should be careful. Repeating a fantasy doesn't make reality obey you. The value is in reinforcing the identity and intention that guide your actions. You don't say, I am successful and wait. You say, this is what I'm building. Then you organize your behavior around it. And this is where the three characters finally separate. David had a dream, then gave it a direction. Sarah had ability, but allowed fear to define what she believed was possible. Michael had no guarantee, but he built a system around his purpose. None of them received a magical promise that everything would work. They simply developed different relationships with uncertainty. And that may be the real lesson hidden inside this old book. We often ask, how do I become successful? But perhaps the better question is, what kind of person would I have to become to seriously pursue the life I say I want? Because if you want a different future, your behavior has to eventually become compatible with it. You can't say you want freedom and organize every hour around distraction. You can't say you want to build something and endlessly consume information without creating anything. You can't say something matters and repeatedly give your attention to everything except it. Your life is quietly voting for something every day. Your calendar votes. Your habits vote. Your attention votes. Your spending votes. Your relationships vote. Your decisions vote. And those votes eventually create a direction. That doesn't mean your life is completely under your control. It isn't. But it does mean there are parts of your future being shaped right now, whether you're consciously shaping them or not. And perhaps that's why the title Think and Grow Rich can be misunderstood. The think isn't the destination. It's the beginning of awareness. You decide what matters. You develop a definite purpose. You learn what is required. You surround yourself with useful knowledge and people. You act. You fail. You adjust. You persist. And over time, your thinking and behavior begin moving in the same direction. Now imagine David 10 years from now. Maybe he succeeds. Maybe he doesn't become as wealthy as he imagined. Maybe his original dream changes completely. But something important has already happened. He is no longer waiting for his life to tell him what he should want. He has learned to choose a direction and take responsibility for pursuing it. And Sarah, perhaps her greatest victory isn't becoming rich. It's discovering that fear doesn't have to make every decision for her. And Michael, he learns perhaps the hardest lesson of all. Even persistence needs wisdom. Sometimes the courage to continue is matched by the courage to change direction. So maybe the question isn't, will I become rich? Maybe the better question is, what am I willing to think about, learn about, work on, and persist through for years? Because that question forces you to confront something uncomfortable. You don't become what you occasionally wish for. You tend to move toward what you repeatedly give your attention, decisions, and effort to. And tomorrow morning, your circumstances may look exactly the same. Same room, same job, same bank account, same problems. But you will still have a choice. You can continue waiting for the perfect circumstances. Or you can decide what future you're going to start organizing your life around. Because perhaps becoming rich was never the deepest promise of Napoleon Hill's book. Perhaps the deeper promise was this: you don't have to know exactly how your future will happen before you begin acting like it matters. And once you choose a definite direction, your questions change, your attention changes, your decisions change. And eventually, your life begins responding to those changes. Not magically, not instantly, but one decision at a time. So ask yourself tonight, what do I actually want? Not what sounds impressive. Not what other people expect. Not what you think you're supposed to want. What do you actually want? And then ask the harder question. What am I willing to repeatedly do for it? Because the first question creates a dream. The second creates a person capable of pursuing it. And that may be where your real journey begins.